Static and Silence. Part 1. Blue Above, Blue Below. The Cessna 172 smelled, as it always had, of avgas and old vinyl, and something that might once have been a ham sandwich. Owen Hartley had owned the little plane for 11 years, and in that time he had carried it across 3 continents and more miles of open water than his insurance broker would ever know about. He called her Polaris, which was a joke of sorts, since the plane's ancient compass had a tendency to drift 3 degrees east of true north. You had to know her, he always said. You had to account for her. His son Callum had been accounting for her his entire life. The boy was 12, all elbows and questions, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's infuriating habit of staying quiet when he was most frightened. He sat in the co-pilot's seat with a laminated chart folded across his knees and a half-eaten Tim Tam in his left hand, staring out at the Pacific with the concentrated expression of someone memorizing a dream before it fades. "We're over the Coral Sea," Owen said, tapping the chart on Callum's lap. "See that little cluster there? D'Entrecasteaux Islands. We'll be past them in 40 minutes. Then what? Then a lot of nothing. Then Micronesia." Callum chewed his biscuit and looked at the nothing. They had departed Cairns that morning before first light, bleary-eyed and thermos-clutching, while the rest of Queensland was still asleep. Owen had filed the route with CASA days earlier, Cairns to Honiara in the Solomon Islands for fuel, then north toward Majuro in the Marshall Islands, where Owen's university friend, a marine biologist named Paul Tsuru, was waiting to host them for 2 weeks. It was the adventure Owen had been promising since Callum was 8. He'd had to postpone it twice, once for a broken fibula, his own, and once for a broken heart, the boy's, over a school camp friendship that ended badly. Now here they were at last, 2 Hartley men alone above the Coral Sea, the world below them turquoise and measureless. It was, Callum had decided as the sun came up behind them in a great red wash, the best morning of his life. They landed in Honiara at 11 local time, refueled in the baking heat of Henderson International, ate greasy rice and chicken from a tin-roofed cafe near the runway, and were airborne again by 1:30. The afternoon sky over the Solomons was immense and clear, interrupted only by towers of cumulus to the northeast that Owen studied with the squinting respect of a man who has been surprised by weather before. "Those look moody," Callum said. "They're a long way off. We'll stay south of them." Owen adjusted their heading slightly. "How's the pressure?" Callum read the altimeter, the vertical speed indicator, the manifold pressure gauge. Owen had been teaching him the instruments since he was 9, matter-of-factly, the way other fathers teach their kids to ride a bike. Manifolds 23. Oil's good. Exhaust gas temp looks fine. Good lad. They flew north by northeast. The cumulus towers drifted east and stopped threatening. The sea below changed color by degree, from the rich green-blue of the Solomon's Passage to the deeper imperial indigo of the open Pacific. Callum pressed his face to the window and watched a freighter far below, drawing its white wake across the ocean like a chalk line on a chalkboard. "Dad, if the engine stopped right now, could we make it to shore?" Owen glanced at the chart, at the water, at his son. "No," he said, with the flat honesty Callum appreciated most about him. "We'd be about 40 kilometers short of the nearest land. We'd ditch in the ocean, activate the emergency locator, and wait for the Coast Guard." "How long would they take?" "Hours. Maybe longer. Would we be okay?" "We'd be cold and uncomfortable and very bored. But yes, we'd be okay." Callum considered this. "Good," he said, and went back to watching the freighter disappear. Neither of them said what both of them knew, that the engine had no intention of stopping. Polaris had 1,240 hours on her airframe. Her Lycoming engine was fresh from overhaul, and Owen Hartley was a man who checked his checklists twice and then checked them once more. The question had been purely academic. The answer, as it turned out, would not be. Part 2. The engine's confession. It began at 1447, 3 hours north of Honiara, when the sky was its most arrogant blue, and the ocean was featureless in every direction. There was no drama in its beginning, only a sound. A faint, irregular knock from behind the engine cowling, like someone tapping on a door they weren't sure was occupied. Owen heard it immediately. He said nothing, but Callum saw his father's jaw tighten and watched his hands move to the throttle with a kind of deliberate calm that was more frightening than shouting. "Dad, checking something." Owen enriched the mixture, checked the carburetor heat, scanned the gauges. Everything read normal. The knock continued, patient as a metronome. Then, with a sound like a man clearing his throat before an unpleasant announcement, the engine roughened. The RPM needle swung left, steadied, swung left again. "Okay," Owen said quietly. "We have an engine problem." Callum's stomach turned to water. He gripped the armrests and stared at the instruments. "What kind?" "I'm not sure yet. Listen to me." Owen's voice was precise, unhurried, the voice he used when he needed Callum to hear every syllable. "Get the emergency checklist out of the pouch behind my seat. Open it to engine roughness. Read me the steps one at a time." Callum unbuckled, twisted, grabbed the laminated card. His hands shook once and then stopped. He read. Owen responded to each step. Magneto check, no change. Fuel selector to both, already there. Throttle adjustment, marginal improvement. Primer in and locked, confirmed. But the knock was getting louder. Owen picked up the radio. "Brisbane Center, this is Victor Hotel Papa Oscar Lima, Cessna 172, declaring pan. Engine roughness, approximately 400 kilometers north of Honiara. Position." He read their GPS coordinates with steady precision, while Callum watched the oil pressure, which had begun, very quietly, to drop. "Requesting nearest suitable landing." Static. Then a voice, distant through the hiss. "Victor Hotel Papa Oscar Lima, Brisbane Center copies pan. Say souls on board and fuel state. 2 souls. Approximately 3 hours fuel remaining." More static. A long wait. Callum watched the oil pressure needle and counted seconds and tried to breathe. "Victor Hotel Papa Oscar Lima, nearest suitable field is Ontong Java, approximately 90 kilometers on your 040. Note, field is currently unmanned, status unknown. Do you wish to divert?" Owen looked at the oil pressure. It had dropped another 2 units. "Diverting to Ontong Java. Please alert Solomon Islands Search and Rescue." Copied. "Search and rescue is being notified. Report field in sight." He turned to his son. The knock was now a clatter, a rhythmic and insistent. "Put your shoulder harness on tight, seatbelt tight, feet off the rudder pedals. Dad, we're going to land on an island. It's going to be fine. Do what I say." Callum did exactly what he was told. The island appeared out of the haze at 1512, a dark green smudge above the horizon that slowly resolved itself into a ragged atoll, fringed white where the reef broke and dark green where the palms crowded. It was not large. From above it looked like a crescent moon, one thin arm curling toward the other and almost closing. At its widest point, it was perhaps a kilometer across. And there, impossibly, running along the flattest part of the crescent's spine, was a runway. "Oh, thank God," Callum breathed. "It's overgrown," Owen said. "See the grass down the middle? But the surface looks intact." He was already descending, configuring flaps, adjusting pitch. The engine was now running on what sounded like 2 cylinders and an argument. The oil pressure was in the red. "I need to go now. I don't think we have time for a circuit." He lined them up on final approach. The runway oriented roughly north-south, and a light crosswind pushed at them from the east. Owen corrected with patient, minute inputs. The palms rushed toward them. The runway threshold, cracked concrete with dry grass splitting through every joint, came up fast. The engine quit completely at 20 feet. In the sudden silence, Callum heard the wind, the stall warning horn, his father's single sharp exhaled breath. Then the wheels touched, too fast, the left main hitting a raised crack in the surface, and the plane yawed violently, the nose swinging left, the right wing dipping. Owen fought it with everything. Full right rudder, aileron, and the plane straightened, barely. Then the nose wheel hit the ground hard, and something cracked in the instrument panel, and Callum's head hit the window and stillness, dust drifting through shafts of yellow light, the tick of a cooling engine, the distant mutter of surf. Callum raised his head, blinked, touched his temple where a throb had begun. His fingers came away with a thin smear of blood, nothing serious. He turned to his father. Owen Hartley had his eyes closed, both hands still wrapped around the control yoke, and there was a deep graze running from his forehead to his left cheekbone, where his head had struck the side window during the ground roll. A thin river of blood tracked down his jaw. But he was breathing. Callum could see his chest rise, and after a moment his eyes opened, unfocused, swimming. Dad, we down?" Owen's voice was thick, syrupy. Yes, we're down. Can you hear me? Fuel off, Owen said, by pure reflex. Master switch off. Mags off. Callum reached across and did all three. Then he looked at his father, who had closed his eyes again. Dad. Don't sleep. Dad. Owen opened his eyes with visible effort. I'm here, Cal. Just give me a minute. Outside, the island waited, ancient and indifferent, in the shimmering afternoon heat. Part 3. The island's inventory. Callum's first task, after he had helped his father out of the cockpit and onto the grass beside the runway, was to not panic. This took approximately 60 seconds of sitting very still with his back against the Cessna's fuselage, knees drawn up, listening to the surf and the wind in the palms and his own breathing, which kept wanting to come in ragged gulps instead of slow, useful measures. He gave himself 60 seconds. Then he stood up. Owen was propped against the plane's wheel, conscious but pale, a compress made from Callum's spare shirt pressed against his head wound. He had diagnosed himself, between lucid stretches, with confidence-eroding accuracy, likely concussion, possibly a cracked rib from where his torso had impacted the door during the yaw. He could walk if he had to. He'd rather not have to. The emergency locator, he said. Did it activate on impact? Callum checked the panel. The indicator light was dark. He toggled it manually. Nothing. He pulled it from its bracket and inspected it. The antenna lead had torn free in the landing. The connector stripped. He tried to rejoin it. The threads had sheared. He showed his father. Owen stared at it for a long moment. Brisbane Center knows our approximate position. Search and rescue is notified. They'll start searching, but... He stopped. Swallowed. It might take some time. We need to make sure we can be found, and we need shelter and water. I know. Callum put the locator in his pocket. Useless, but something. Rest. I'm going to look around. Don't go far. I won't. The island was small enough that Callum could see the sea on both sides from the runway's midpoint. The runway itself ran perhaps 600 meters along the spine of the atoll, the concrete cracked and colonized by determined weeds, and, at the southern end, entirely surrendered to a banyan tree whose roots had buckled the surface into abstract sculpture. At the northern end, half hidden by palms and by time, were buildings. There were 4 of them. A large corrugated iron shed, walls bleached to the color of old bone, 2 smaller structures of the same material, one collapsed on one side, and a squat concrete block building with louvered windows, most of the louvres still intact, that sat apart from the others with the self-important air of something that had once mattered. All 4 were connected by a concrete path so cracked and overgrown, it took Callum a moment to recognize it as intentional. Military, he thought. Or some kind of government station. Old. Abandoned for years. Maybe decades. He stood in the clearing between the buildings and turned slowly, making an inventory. Overhead, the palms clicked and rattled in the sea breeze. Something rustled in the iron shed, a bird, he hoped, though the sound was furtive enough to briefly conjure a less comfortable explanation. The sun had declined toward the west and was throwing long shadows across the atoll. He needed water, shelter, a way to signal or communicate. He had a crash-landed aeroplane, a hurt father, his own 2 hands, and he patted his pockets, a Swiss Army knife, a coil of paracord, half a Tim Tam, and the dead emergency locator. He started with the concrete block building. The door had swollen in its frame from years of tropical humidity, and it took Callum 3 hard shoves with his shoulder to open it. Inside, the air was dense and old, carrying the particular smell of long disuse, mildew, rust, and something faintly electrical that might have been imagination. Slanted light fell through the intact louvres in dusty bands. The room was perhaps 5 meters by 6. Along one wall, a bench ran its full length, solid timber, bolted to the studs, too heavy to have been worth carting away. On the bench, in various states of dismemberment and decay, was equipment. Callum moved closer, picking his way over a fallen ceiling tile. He recognized some of it. The shape of radio equipment was unmistakable once you knew it. Rectangular chassis, knobs and dials, the ghost of a speaker grill. There were 3 or 4 units in various conditions, stripped of anything valuable, their cases opened, and their innards picked through by whoever had decommissioned this place. Lengths of coaxial cable draped like dead vines from hooks on the wall. A ceramic antenna insulator, intact, hanging from a nail. A tangle of bare copper wire looped around a wooden spool. And on the floor, beneath the bench, 3 cardboard boxes with military markings so faded they were barely legible. Callum dragged the first box into the light. It contained paper, manuals, logbooks, water swollen to uselessness. The second box held a surprising bounty: 2 sealed tins of something, a length of copper antenna wire still in its original wrapping, a handful of alligator clips in a Ziploc bag, and a torch. He tried the torch. Dead, as expected, but the body was intact. The third box held what appeared to be a disassembled crystal oscillator assembly, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it with unexpected fidelity. Callum sat back on his heels and stared at the contents of the 3 boxes. The thought arrived not as inspiration but as a slow, cold certainty, the way the answer to a long maths problem surfaces not in a flash but in a quiet, inevitable click. I can build a radio. He had never built a radio, but he knew, in the particular way that a certain kind of 12-year-old knows things they've read about obsessively without consciously meaning to, the principles. His grandfather, his mother's father, had been a ham operator. Pop Reese, with his shack in the garden shed in Ballarat and his endless patience for explaining ionospheric propagation to a 7-year-old who asked too many questions. Pop Reese, who died 3 years ago and left Callum his amateur radio handbook as a specific bequest, which Callum had read approximately 4 times and understood perhaps 60% of. A basic transmitter, a crystal oscillator for frequency stability, an antenna, power from the aircraft battery, if he could access it, and if it hadn't been damaged in the landing. He picked up the oilcloth-wrapped oscillator assembly and held it in both hands. "Okay," he said to nobody. "Okay." Part 4. Night on the Atoll. The first order was his father. Callum returned to Owen as the light was thinning toward amber, carrying both tins from the supply box. One was corned beef. He worked the lid off with the can opener on his Swiss Army knife, and the other was condensed milk. He also brought the length of paracord and the oilcloth to wrap around his father's torso for support. Owen ate the corned beef slowly, lucid now but clearly in pain. The head wound had stopped bleeding and had begun to bruise, a plum-dark swelling above his left eye. His breathing was careful, deliberate. Ribs, Callum guessed, and said nothing about it. "Water," Owen said. "That's priority." "I know. I'll find some. Coconuts, green ones, the liquid inside." "I know what coconuts are, Dad." A ghost of a smile. "Right. Of course you do." Callum found coconuts, a cluster of young green ones low enough to knock free with a length of steel conduit he found behind the iron shed. He opened 2, and Owen drank deeply, eyes closed. "Now tell me," Owen said, when he'd finished. "What did you find in those buildings?" Callum told him. Owen listened without interrupting, and when Callum got to the part about the radio components, his father was quiet for a long moment, watching him with an expression Callum couldn't quite name, something between pride and a very private fear. "You think you can do it," Owen said. It wasn't a question. "I think I can build a transmitter. I don't know if it'll work, but I want to try. What do you need from me?" "Rest. And stay awake every half hour so I know your concussion isn't getting worse." Owen looked at his son for a long moment. "When did you get so competent?" "About 4 hours ago." Night arrived over the Pacific the way it always does in the tropics, without ceremony, without the long, protracted twilight of southern latitudes. One moment it was dusk, and the next it was dark. Vast and star-salted and absolute. Callum had moved his father into the concrete block building before the light went, arranging him on a bed of palm fronds with the oilcloth as a blanket. Owen had protested, and then not protested. The island at night was alive in ways it hadn't seemed during the day. Tree frogs made their electric clicking in the undergrowth. Something moved in the iron shed. Callum had investigated with the torch at last light, working for 20 minutes to restore power using the 2 batteries from the aircraft's handheld GPS, and found a colony of large crabs that regarded him with tilted, ancient eyes before clattering back into the shadows. He left them to it. He worked by torchlight at the long bench, the components spread before him. He had found several more useful items in a final sweep of the iron shed. A car battery, dead, but he would deal with that. 3 porcelain fuse holders, a transformer he could repurpose for impedance matching, and hanging on a nail so rusted he almost missed it, a pair of earphones, military surplus, one side cracked but one side possibly still functional. He opened his memory of the handbook's pages on simple transmitter design and began to build. Outside, the surf continued its patient work on the reef, as it had for 10,000 years before this particular boy arrived on this particular island with his particular problem. The stars wheeled above the palms. Somewhere to the south, rescue aircraft were being readied. But here, in the small yellow circle of a repurposed torch, a 12-year-old was doing the only thing available to him. Something. His father drifted in and out. Every 30 minutes, Callum shook him gently, asked him his name, asked him where they were, asked him what year it was. Owen answered correctly each time, though once he said they were in Broome, and once he said it was 2019, and Callum let those go, and only required his name, which was always correct. "What are you building?" Owen asked around midnight, his voice stronger than it had been at sunset. "An oscillator stage first. Then I need to amplify it enough to drive an antenna." "Power?" "The aircraft battery. I pulled it this afternoon. It's a 12-volt sealed lead acid, still showing about 10.5 volts. It's had a hard day, but it should be enough." Owen made a sound that might have been impressed or might have been the ribs. "Frequency? The crystal is stamped 14.225 megahertz. That's the 20-meter band. It's international. If anyone's listening, they'll hear. Maybe." Owen reached out and put his hand briefly on Callum's arm, then let it drop. "Keep going," he said, and closed his eyes. Part 5. The second day. Dawn came in pink and startling, and with it came the crabs. Callum woke on the bench with his cheek on his arm, the earphones around his neck, the torch dimming, and a very large coconut crab, walking with deliberate authority across the concrete floor toward Owen's palm frond bed. He sat up fast, grabbed the conduit, and herded the crab back toward the door, where it made its exit with unhurried dignity. Owen was awake. He looked better. The swelling had reduced slightly, and his eyes were clear and tracking properly. "Morning," he said. "Morning. Coconut for breakfast? Is there an alternative?" "Condensed milk." "Coconut it is." While Owen ate, Callum reviewed his night's work in the early light. The oscillator stage was complete and tested. A simple, crystal-controlled circuit built on a scrap of aluminium bent from the side of a stripped radio chassis. Components soldered with a piece of resin core wire he'd melted into a dip using the lighter from the aircraft's emergency kit. He'd verified it was oscillating by holding the earphone against the circuit and hearing a faint, steady whine at the appropriate pitch. What he lacked was amplification. He needed a transistor or a valve. The stripped radio carcasses on the bench had been picked down to their bones. He had searched them all twice. He went to search a third time. The iron shed was larger than it looked from outside, perhaps 15 meters deep, its rear lost in shadow. Callum worked his way through it methodically, torch in hand, moving crab colonies aside with the conduit and lifting corroded sheet metal with careful hands. There were tools, rusted to uselessness, most of them. There was a vehicle, a Land Rover or something like it, reduced to a skeleton of rust and perished rubber, its engine stripped. There was a wooden pallet on which sat several drums, sealed, whose labels had long since dissolved. And in the far corner, behind the pallet and beneath a square of canvas so rotten it fell apart when he lifted it, was a crate. The crate was military surplus, screwed shut with heavy bolts. He worked the screws with a rusted spanner he found on the floor. 3 of the 4 came free, the 4th sheared, and pried the lid with the conduit until it cracked open. Inside, cushioned in crumbling foam rubber, were radio parts. Not stripped or salvaged parts. Intact parts. Components still in their original paper envelopes. Labels intact. Resistors, capacitors, inductors. And at the bottom of the crate, in a separate compartment sealed with a rubber gasket that had outlasted everything around it. Vacuum tubes. 8 of them, each in its own cardboard sleeve. Military specification power tubes. Old technology. 50-year-old technology. Possibly. Indestructible. Possibly. Callum stared at them for a very long moment. Then he started running. He worked through the morning without stopping. Owen, who was able to sit upright now and make his slow way to the door for air, listened to the progress reports with the particular expression of a man who wants to help, and knows the most useful thing he can do is stay out of the way. The vacuum tubes needed a proper power supply, more voltage than the aircraft battery alone could provide. The transformer from the iron shed was a step-up type, and the aircraft battery could run through it to produce the necessary high tension, though the current would be thin, and the efficiency terrible. Callum wired it with bare hands, careful to discharge the capacitors before touching anything, using a technique Pop Reese had shown him, tapping a screwdriver blade across the terminals while looking away. He burned 2 fingers on a capacitor that hadn't discharged fully. He wrapped them in strips from his other shirt, kept working. The antenna was the last problem. He had the copper wire from the supply box, enough for a half-wave dipole on 14 megahertz, which required approximately 10 meters per leg. He used the paracord to hoist it between the highest palm he could climb and the corner of the concrete block building, feeding the coaxial cable through a louvre. He sweated through his shirt twice during the climb. At 2 in the afternoon, sweaty and shaking and desperately thirsty, he sat down at the bench and looked at what he had made. It was ugly. It was held together with hope and solder blobs and 3 different gauges of wire. The tube glowed amber, the filaments were drawing current, which meant the power supply was working. The crystal oscillator stage connected to the driver, and the driver to the power tube in the final amplifier stage, and the final amplifier to the antenna through the impedance-matching transformer. Whether it would radiate anything intelligible to anyone listening was a question he could not answer in advance. He had found, among the components in the crate, a Morse code key, a simple hand-operated brass key, the kind that hadn't changed in design since the 19th century. He connected it to the input of the oscillator stage to allow keying. Then he sat for 10 minutes in the hot afternoon silence, moving his fingers against the bench, practicing. He knew his Morse code. He had learned it from Pop Reese. He'd thought, at the time, that it was useless knowledge, a relic, a game, an old man's indulgence. He would never in his life tell another living person that he had thought that. He knew it. He would use it. He pressed the key. Part 6. Into the static. There is a particular loneliness to transmitting into an empty frequency. No matter how rationally you understand that radio waves travel at the speed of light, that your signal is at this very moment reaching the ionosphere and bending back toward Earth and touching 1,000 receivers in 100 countries, the act of pressing a key and hearing nothing in return has the quality of shouting into a cave. Callum transmitted for 10 minutes. He sent the international distress signal, SOS, followed by his call sign he used his father's, which he'd memorized, Victor Hotel Papa Oscar Lima, followed by their position from the aircraft's GPS, which he'd noted before the battery died. He keyed it slowly, clearly 3 times over. Then he listened. Static, the broad hiss of the ionosphere, occasionally punctuated by something that might have been a fragment of another signal or might have been nothing. He transmitted again, listened. Nothing. He checked on his father. Owen was awake, sitting with his back against the building's outer wall in a strip of shade, his color better, his breathing still careful around the ribs. Anything? Not yet. The 20-meter band is better in the evening, more reliable propagation. I'll keep trying. Owen nodded. You should eat something. I had condensed milk. That's not eating. The island, it turned out, had more to offer than coconuts. Callum had noticed, on his morning circuit of the atoll's lagoon side, that the reef flat at low tide hosted a rich population of small crabs, different from the terrifying coconut crabs, shore crabs no larger than a fist, and something that appeared to be a variety of periwinkle clustered on every rock surface. He had also found, growing in a shaded ravine near the runway's southern end where a concrete drain collected rainwater, a mat of watercress, or something very like it, peppery and green and astonishingly delicious when you hadn't eaten a real meal in 24 hours. He made a pile of it on a large leaf and brought it back for his father, who ate it with the thoughtful appreciation of a man who had been genuinely uncertain he'd eat again. There's also a concrete cistern behind the shed, Callum said. I cleared the debris off it this morning. There's water. I don't know how old, but it smells all right. I'll boil some tonight. Owen stared at him. When did you find time to do all of this? Early. You were asleep. Cal. His father's voice was strange, rougher than the ribs warranted. I need you to know. Don't. Callum said it before he could stop himself. He wasn't sure why. Only that whatever his father was about to say felt like something he couldn't hold yet, not while there was still work to do. Later. Tell me later. Owen looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Later, he agreed. The second night fell. Callum sat at the bench with the earphones on and transmitted every 20 minutes. SOS, position, Victor Hotel Papa Oscar Lima, and between transmissions he listened. The 20-meter band at night was alive with signals, fragments of conversation in languages he didn't recognize, a weather broadcast in American English, the mechanical sounds of a beacon somewhere to the north, bursts of digital mode data that sounded like bird song. The band was full. Someone was using it. The world was out there, talking. At 21:40 local time, on his 11th transmission, something changed. He was 4 characters into his SOS when the static shifted, a distinctive, purposeful shift, and through it came a voice. Faint, buried in noise, but unmistakably human, unmistakably directed at him. He grabbed the earphones with both hands and pressed them hard against his ears. Station calling distress. This is a wall of static. Repeat your position. Callum's hands went to the key. He sent the position again, 3 times, slow and clear. Silence. Then, copied, stand by. And then silence. Long, agonizing silence. 2 minutes of it. 3. Callum sat absolutely still, earphones crushing his ears, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that motion might somehow break the fragile thread across the ionosphere. Then the voice returned, stronger now, as if the operator had adjusted something. Station calling distress. This is W7AJX, amateur station, Majuro, Marshall Islands. We copy your position. Can you advise souls and condition? Over. Majuro. Where they had been going. Callum pressed the key, and the words came out of him in Morse with a fluency he didn't know he had. The way adrenaline unlocks things that fear would otherwise lock away. 2 souls. Pilot injured, concussion, possible rib fracture, stable. Boy age 12, uninjured. Cessna 172 VH pole. Engine failure. Force landed Ontong Java Atoll. No emergency locator. Please advise search and rescue status. Need medical assistance for pilot. Over. He released the key. His hands were trembling. The response came within 30 seconds. Copy all. This is remarkable work. We have Solomon Islands search and rescue on phone right now. They have you as missing. Search ongoing. Stand by. Do not leave your radio. Callum pulled off the earphones. His vision had blurred. He was crying, he realized, without having decided to, the tears arriving as though from a separate source than his own intentions. He wiped his face on his arm and put the earphones back on. He wasn't going to miss a single word. Part 7. The longest night. He went to tell his father. Owen was awake. He had been awake, Callum suspected, for some time, lying in the dark and listening to the key clicks with his eyes closed and his face composed into the particular stillness of a man keeping very careful control of himself. When Callum said, "I made contact," Owen's eyes opened. When Callum said, "Majuro, search and rescue knows where we are," Owen closed his eyes again and turned his face toward the wall, and his shoulders moved in a way that Callum had only ever seen once before, at his grandfather's funeral, and he had the grace to look away. When the silence had lasted long enough, Owen said, "Good lad," in a voice that sounded like it had been wrung out. "I need to go back," Callum said. "They might call again." "Go." The man at W7AJX turned out to be named Robert Chutaro, and he was, as he explained between relay conversations with Solomon Islands Search and Rescue, a retired telecoms engineer who had maintained his amateur radio license for 40 years, purely for situations exactly like this one. He had a voice like gravel and warm water, and he spoke to Callum with the matter-of-fact friendliness of a man who regarded a 12-year-old building a valve radio on a deserted atoll as entirely reasonable behavior, worthy of neither excessive praise nor excessive alarm. He was, Callum decided, the best person he had ever spoken to. The information came in pieces over the next 2 hours. Search and Rescue had confirmed that an aircraft and a rescue vessel were being dispatched from Honiara. The aircraft, a Royal New Zealand Air Force patrol plane on a training rotation through the region, would arrive over the atoll around dawn to confirm location and drop supplies. The vessel, a Solomon Islands Coast Guard cutter, was 12 hours out. There was a medical officer aboard. "They're asking if your pilot can be moved," Robert relayed, "or if they'll need a hoist." Callum went to check. Owen, after much negotiation, agreed that he could walk to a pickup point if given time and assistance. Callum relayed this. "Copy. The aircraft will do a visual pass first light. Confirm your position with a smoke signal if you have one." Callum did not have a smoke signal. He found, in the aircraft's emergency kit, 2 of them. The remaining hours before dawn had their own texture, slow and thick as cooling tar. Callum maintained his radio watch, exchanging check-ins with Robert every 30 minutes. He boiled cistern water in a tin can over a fire built from palm debris, and he and his father drank it in the dark, bitter and clean. At one point, Owen asked, in a drowsy voice, "Did you sleep?" "A bit. Don't lie to your father." "I dozed at the bench." "That doesn't count." "I know." A pause. "The surf. The frogs. Your grandfather would have loved this," Owen said. "Pop Reese. The radio thing." Callum was quiet. Then, "I know. I kept thinking about him while I was building it. He taught you well. He taught me to read a book. I did the rest." He felt his father's hand on his shoulder, brief and certain, and then withdraw. "That's all you ever need," Owen said. "Someone to point you at the books." The fire crackled. The Pacific wheeled overhead in its stars. Shortly before 4 in the morning, Owen fell into the first proper sleep he'd had since the crash. Slow breathing, relaxed, his face finally losing its taut management of pain. Callum watched him for a minute, then turned back to the radio. At 5:23, Robert's voice came through with an edge of warmth that hadn't been there before. "Callum, aircraft is 40 minutes out. Prepare your smoke. And son, I want you to know that in 40 years of amateur radio, this is the finest piece of work I have ever witnessed. Your grandfather would be very proud. W7 Ajax. Over." Callum sat with that for a long time. Then he keyed his response. "Thank you, Robert. For everything. VH Pol. Over and out. Part 8. Morning. The patrol aircraft came out of the east with the sun. Callum heard it before he saw it. A deep, 4-engined thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once, shaking the palm fronds and raising a colony of white birds from the tree line in a shrieking cloud. He had Owen on his feet already, wrapped in the oilcloth against the morning chill, leaning against the concrete block building. They both looked up when the sound reached them, and there, low and enormous and impossibly purposeful, the gray aircraft swept across the atoll from south to north at perhaps 300 feet. Callum pulled the pin on the smoke flare and held it at arm's length. Brilliant orange smoke uncoiled into the still air. The aircraft banked, came around, made a second pass lower still. He could see the crew windows, could imagine the eyes behind them. The aircraft rocked its wings, once, twice, the universal language that requires no radio, no Morse, no technology at all. "We see you. We have you. You are found." The flare burned for 60 seconds and guttered out. The aircraft climbed away to the east, waggling its wings one last time, and then it was a speck, and then it was gone. But it had been here. It had seen them. And somewhere on the ocean to the south, a Coast Guard cutter was pushing through the morning swells with a medical officer aboard and a cup of hot coffee that had Callum's name on it. Owen sat down heavily on the concrete step, and Callum sat beside him, and neither of them said anything for a while. The birds settled back into the palms. The surf continued. The island was exactly what it had always been. Old, patient, indifferent. But this morning it felt, improbably, like home. "You were going to tell me something," Callum said eventually. "Yesterday, you said I need you to know, and I told you to tell me later." Owen looked at him sidelong. "So I was. Is it later?" "I reckon it's later." Owen put his arm around his son's shoulders, carefully, on account of the ribs, and Callum leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his father's living weight. "I was going to say," Owen began, "that I'm sorry for getting us into this. For the engine, I should have had it checked more thoroughly before we left. I always push the maintenance window a bit. And this time, Dad, I'm your father. I'm supposed to be the one who—" "Dad," Callum turned to look at him. "You kept the plane together until we had a runway. You got us down alive. If you'd been unconscious 5 minutes earlier, we'd have been in the water." Owen started to object. "And then I handled it. We both did our part. That's how it works, isn't it? Isn't that what you always say? Everyone does their part. Owen was quiet. The sun was fully up now, the atoll bright and tropical vivid, the lagoon behind the runway shading from turquoise to jade. Somewhere out on the reef a booby bird was standing on a coral head, looking west as if expecting something. Everyone does their part, Owen confirmed. Right. So, Callum settled his head against his father's shoulder. It's done, we're okay. The Coast Guard cutter Guadalcanal came through the passage in the reef at 9:30 that morning, feeling its way carefully with a leadsman in the bow. It dropped anchor in the lagoon and put a rigid inflatable over the side. And the inflatable brought 4 people to the beach on the lagoon side. 2 crew, the medical officer, a brisk Fijian woman named Lieutenant Commander Sarah Nakali, who examined Owen with efficient thoroughness and declared him fit to transport, and a 4th person who climbed out of the inflatable. Last, stood on the sand, and cupped his hands around his mouth. Callum Hartley, this person bellowed across the atoll. Callum, who was helping Owen down toward the beach, stopped and stared. The man was in his 50s, slight, with gray-streaked hair and sunburnt shoulders, wearing a Hawaiian shirt that was committing several crimes simultaneously. He was waving both arms. Is that, Callum started? Paul Tsuru, Owen confirmed, in a voice that mixed exhaustion and deep affection in equal parts. He must have caught the cutter out of Honiara. Only Paul Tsuru would talk his way onto a Coast Guard rescue vessel. Paul Tsuru reached them on the beach in a controlled jog, grabbed Owen by both hands, examined his head wound with theatrical horror, and then turned to Callum with an expression that made Callum feel seen in a way that was almost too much to bear. I spoke to Robert Chutaro on the phone this morning, Paul said. He's coming to Majuro next week specifically to meet you. He told me to tell you, Paul paused, gathering the message correctly, that your oscillator to antenna efficiency was, quote, probably terrible, and that he has many improvements to suggest, and that he would like to show you in person. Callum laughed. It came out louder and longer than he intended, and then Owen was laughing too, and even Lieutenant Commander Nakalai allowed herself a small smile before gesturing firmly toward the inflatable and medical realities. They walked together toward the water, the 3 of them, Paul's arm around Owen, Callum at his father's other side, and the Coast Guard crew waited in the shallows with quiet, professional patience. Callum looked back once, from the inflatable, at the island. The concrete block building was already half obscured by palms, the runway a gray stripe through the green. The crabs were probably back in the iron shed. The cistern was full of water nobody would drink. And in the dim interior of that building, on a bench that smelled of rust and time and resin core solder, was a radio that shouldn't work, built by a boy who didn't know he could, that had sent a signal across the ionosphere in the dark and found on the other side of the Pacific night someone listening. He faced forward. The cutter was waiting. They arrived in Majuro 3 days later, the Coast Guard vessel having diverted to Honiara first for Owen's x-rays, 2 cracked ribs, the concussion resolving cleanly, and then north on a following sea under a sky so consistently fine it seemed like an apology. Paul Tsuru talked for the entire journey, hardly pausing for breath, catching them up on 2 years of marine biology in the Marshall Islands, with the inexhaustible enthusiasm of a man who has found his exact right place in the world. Callum sat on the cutter's deck in the evenings and listened to the shortwave radio the communications officer had let him use, scanning the 20-meter band as the sun went down and the ionosphere warmed to its work, hearing in the static all the voices of all the people talking across all that open air, and felt something he would not have known how to name before this week, but could name easily now. The particular and permanent knowledge that the world is full of people willing to listen for signals from the dark, if only you are willing to transmit. Owen sat beside him on the deck on the last evening, both of them facing west where the sky had gone pink and the ocean was brass, and the Marshall Islands were a green smudge growing on the horizon. Owen's ribs were strapped, and his head wound was healing, and he had reclaimed, with visible relief, the role of capable adult. He had also, quietly, called Callum's mother from the ship's satellite phone to tell her they were safe. This conversation had lasted 45 minutes, and included, as Callum learned later, a long section where Owen described in careful detail exactly what his son had done, what he had built, and how it had worked, his voice apparently steady throughout until it wasn't. Sitting on the deck in the last light, Owen said, I'm going to have the engine done properly before we fly home. Good idea. And I'm going to get the emergency locator replaced. Also a good idea. And I thought, if you're interested, Owen watched the horizon, we might look into getting you a Foundation amateur radio license when we get home. Callum considered this. Pop Reese's call sign, he said. Victor Kilo, 3 Romeo Juliet Romeo. Do you think they'd let me use it? As a memorial call sign or something? Owen was quiet for a moment. I'll find out. The island was close enough now that Callum could see individual palms, the white thread of the reef. Somewhere ashore, Robert Chutaro was preparing a guest room and probably, knowing amateur radio operators, building some improvement to an antenna. Paul Tsuru was cooking. He had promised something with reef fish that he described as transformative, and the evening was still, and the sea was calm. And in all the world there was no better place than exactly here. Callum Hartley was 12 years old, and had built a radio out of scrap on a deserted island in the Pacific Ocean, and called for help across the dark, and been heard. Whatever came after, he knew, with the bone-deep, unshakable certainty of someone who has tested a thing under real conditions, that he would always be able to find a frequency, always be able to send the signal. Someone would be listening. Someone always was. The end?